Okay, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Robert Puentes. I'm the president and CEO of the ENO Center for Transportation, and I want to welcome you to this webinar, Understanding the Travel Trends of Teens and Young Adults. As somebody who has 3 teens at home, this is a conversation that's very interesting to me personally, but few topics really do garner, I think, more attention than this, and also I think a lot of misconceptions and ambiguity. We know that U.S. motorists set a new record for driving in 2016, logging in over 3.2 trillion miles. But others point to the long-term trends, especially driving per capita, to suggest that we're moving in a new direction. But when it comes to young adults and millennials, there's still a lot that we don't know. Are they truly rejecting suburban, auto-oriented lifestyles favored by their parents? Are they moving to cities where they travel more by foot, bike, and public transit? Are they relying more on telecommunications and technology, reducing the need for driving? Or are tougher economic times keeping them from getting behind the wheel? We know this is complicated stuff, and so to help us sort all this out, we couldn't have 2 better people than we have here to work this through with us today. Evelyn Bloomberg is the professor of urban planning at the UCLA Luskin School of Public Affairs, and Brian Taylor is also professor of urban planning at the UCLA Luskin School. Evie and Brian are going to present the results of a multi-year study of millennials and travel to help us understand what's really going on. Some of the reports and the products from that initiative are on the events page on the ENO website. They will then take your questions through the chat function on the webinar website, but you don't have to wait until they're done to ask questions. You can submit them during the presentation. I'm sure you're going to find their work interesting and timely, even if you don't have kids. And I want to thank you all again for joining us today. With that, let's take it away, Evie.
Thanks. Welcome, everybody. As Rob said, Brian Taylor and I are going to talk about research that we have done on understanding the travel trends of teens and young adults. The first slide that you see. The research was prompted by the images that you're going to see on the next 2 slides. So the first is the decline in VMT that started, the vehicle miles traveled, that started in 2007, right before the recession, and continued through 2011, and you can see that on this graph. And then coupled, you see this arrow going back and forth, coupled with the idea that was certainly well promoted by the media as well as some researchers, that something is brewing, that there might be factors that make youth disinterested in cars and in driving. And so what you see, the image on the right, looks at the decline in licensing rates among teens. So with this as the background, we, with a very large group of student researchers, worked on 2 major research projects focused on the 3 following questions. The first is the popularity of driving waning among youth? The second, if so, why? And the third, is this a good thing or a bad thing, good or bad news? Okay. So what potentially is brewing? Why might the popularity of driving be waning among youth? Well, first, there might be a cultural turn among youth toward more urban, less car-dependent lifestyle. A second factor could be the adoption of greener attitudes and beliefs. The third might be sort of stricter driver's licensing, and that's a piece of it, sort of changes in the regulatory framework. The fourth might be, at least during this period of time, higher fuel prices. We talked a little bit already about the prolonged economic downturn playing a role. There could be delayed transitions to adulthood. So young adults taking a longer time to get married and have kids. Technology, I have young adults in my household as well, and so technology certainly plays a role in their behavior, all aspects of their behavior. And it could be, and a lot of my colleagues would hope that this plays a role, the improved provision of public transit, biking, and walking infrastructure or facilities. So what you see on this next slide is the cover of our two reports that you could sort of get off the web. We did both of these projects for the Federal Highway Administration, and we relied on data. So we're going to be reporting on data that's from the National Travel Surveys, various versions of the survey. Now, we clearly can't talk about everything in the short amount of time, but if you want all the nitty-gritty, you can look to these reports. So today, for the remainder of our time, we're going to focus on our four principal findings. I'm going to talk about them here, and Brian's going to return to them at the end of our talk. So the first finding is that through 2009 and the recession, there was a significant decline in travel among youth. The second finding is the decline was largely explained by the downturn in the economy. The third finding is youth and older adults travel fewer miles in dense urban areas where they're more likely to use public transit, but these sorts of neighborhoods, these dense urban areas, comprise less than 5% of all US neighborhoods. Driving is highest and the growth fastest in sprawling new development types of neighborhoods. The fourth finding is that young adults who don't drive much grew by about 50% between 1995 and 2009. And while some are highly mobile, multimodal, so taking multiple types of modes, many more are carless and mobility disadvantaged. Okay, so the first research question, so thinking about, what explains personal miles travel. So this slide shows personal miles traveled by age group for our three survey years, 1990, 2001, and 2009. And yes, we see that young adults traveled fewer miles in 2009 than in previous survey years. And so that's the green line that you see in the graph. Now, we did a lot of statistical modeling to identify as best as we could using the data, the factors that contributed to this decline. And this next graph is output from one of these models. And so to summarize, what we find is that employment status has the largest effect on travel, that younger cohorts do travel a bit less than older cohorts, that technology is a complement to travel rather than a substitute for travel, and that finally changes in driver's licensing regulations really were a wash. They had very little effect in explaining the travel behavior and the personal miles of travel of youth. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Brian to talk about the next two research questions.
So a lot of that work that you've just heard so far came from the first phase of our study, and the follow-up questions were related to where youth are living, how that's changing over time, what types of neighborhoods people are in, and how that's related to how people travel. So one of the things that we did at the start of this was to, rather than use typical measures of, say, county level analysis or municipalities, we actually got data from a variety of sources and developed through techniques called factor and then cluster analysis, a typology of types of urban development based on the built form and the transportation network characteristics, not based on the characteristics of the people living there, just the physical characteristics of what the built environment looks like and what the transportation network looks like. So of that, there are 73,000 census tracts in the United States, and we typed all of them. 21% of them are purely rural, and those are often very big, so it's a lot larger share of the total land area. 22% of those tracts are what we call new development. These are the sprawling developments on the fringe, the lowest density, the most auto-oriented. There are two other suburban type of development, what we call patchwork suburban, which is about 18% of all tracts, and that's where you have a mix of commercial areas and suburban development. and then what we called established suburbs, which are older inner ring suburban areas of somewhat higher densities of kind of the early around the wars suburban development. We then had three urban types of land uses. This was what we called urban residential, old urban, which is the most densely developed with the most transit service, and then mixed use, which would be central business districts and outlying districts like Tyson's Corner and other places like that, where you have lots of commercial development. Now, of course, this is an approximation that conflates a lot of things, but allows us to actually look at different types of development, where youth and older adults are living and how that's changing over time. So one of the first things that we did is we looked at how does travel in those neighborhood types vary relative to the rural neighborhoods, which would be the most auto-oriented, right? Because it's very difficult to walk, bike, or take transit in rural areas where the distances are very great. And so what this graph shows is how much people are driving relative to their counterparts in rural areas. And the green bar at the very top, the minus 29%, that means that people in new developments are traveling about 29% less than people in rural areas. The first thing that should jump out at you is that those old urban developments have substantially less driving than other places, for teens, for young adults, and older adults. That's where we see dramatically less driving than in other places. But again, they only count for about 4% of all neighborhoods, and I believe about 16% of all population, because they're so densely developed. The second thing is that the effects of the other neighborhoods, that is the other neighborhood types, are notably similar, with the exception of those sprawling new developments out on the fringe, where you can see that there's considerably more driving relative to the other neighborhood types and especially to those old urban neighborhoods. Now, those sprawling new developments count for about 22% of all neighborhoods in comparison to 4% for old urban. So we have this dilemma that the places where we're seeing the most driving still are growing the fastest, even with some of the urban revitalization that we're seeing around the country. We then went through a process somewhat similar, and we looked at young travelers aged 16 to 36, and we used something called latent class analysis, where we typed them into essentially similar types of travelers. And we came up with essentially 4 types of travelers. Those we described as drivers. Those are people who drive for most of their trips and travel 10 to 12,000 miles a year. They may travel by other means occasionally, but most of their trips are made by driving. Long distance trekkers, who are people who are traveling very long distances, really racking up the miles in their cars and traveling almost exclusively by automobile. What we call multimodals, these are people who have driver's licenses, often have cars available, but they still travel a lot by foot, by bike, and by public transit. They're sort of living the ideal of lots of transportation planners of creating a multimodal environment where people can travel by many means. And then the fourth is what we'd call carless. These are people who do not have a car available to them, rarely, if ever, travel in cars, and make very few trips at all. They're in a very different category. So one of the ways we can measure this is by the daily trips taken by traveler type. And there's actually research that suggests that the more trips that someone takes, the higher quality of life they have. And in fact, the number of daily trips is positively correlated with household income. So we can see for drivers, they're averaging about 4 trips a day on average. That's 2 round trips, out to work and back, out to a store and back. The long distance trekkers, although they're really racking up the miles, aren't making any more trips than the drivers. The multimodals, interestingly enough, these are the people who are driving and using transit and walking and biking, are actually making the most trips of all, about 5 per day. But carless are only making 2 trips a day. These are people who have much higher levels of unemployment, much more likely to be employed half-time, much more likely for youth to be living at home with their parents. These are people who are not getting out much at all. So let's just take a look at the trends in these types of youth travelers. Again, the driver is blue, the long distance trekker is pink, multimodal is green, and carless is orange. That Q1 there on the left, that's the lowest income quintile. And what this says is between 1995 and 2009, what was the change in the relative proportion of people, young people in the lowest income quintile over that period? What we can see is that there was a substantial drop in the number of people who would be classified as drivers, and almost a proportional increase in the number of people classified as carless. And again, remember the year, this is 2009, when youth unemployment was extremely high. We see similar trends for the second lowest income quartile. Contrast that with the highest income quartile. There, we see a drop in the number of people who would be long distance trekkers and an increase, the biggest increase, in the number of people who are multimodals. So we really have two kinds of trends going on here. Among higher income youth, we see a trend toward that multimodal lifestyle that many write about. But at the low end, we see people moving into a situation where they're not traveling by other means. They're really not traveling much at all. So what's the proportion of all of this? Well, even with all of the changes we're seeing, the vast majority of young people are drivers. That is they make most of their trips by motor vehicle. Those long distance trekkers are a relatively small and, remember, shrinking share of the overall population. The multimodals are a disappointingly small share of all travelers. And unfortunately, those without cars, those carless, increased by about 50% from about 9 to 14 or 15% of the population. So what we saw was we did see a growth in the multimodals by about 50%, from about 3 to about 4.5%. But we saw the increase in during this period of those without access to cars at all from about 9 to 15%. And that was the growth of people who were doing very little traveling of any sort. So again, to come back to our four principal findings. First, that through the recession, there was a significant decline in travel among youth. The new National Household Travel Survey data are due out this December, and we're excitedly waiting receipt of them so we can look at how things have changed as youth employment, for example, has rebounded. But you should know that it's rebounded much more slowly than it did for the general population. So we should see a lag in this response. Again, that decline that we saw between 1995 and 2009 was largely explained by the downturn of the economy. We did have some what we call residual effect of young people traveling less, on the order of about 7% less, but that was relatively small compared to the big effect of the economy. Third is that youth, as well as older adults, do travel fewer miles in dense urban areas where they're much more likely to use public transit. But again, those dense urban areas comprise about less than 5% of all urban neighborhoods. And I will add that about half of all of those neighborhoods are in metropolitan New York, and about 90% are in the 5 largest metropolitan areas in the country. Driving is highest and growth is fastest in sprawling new developments. And even though in proportional terms, the number of young people in those developments is relatively low, in absolute terms, their growth is the highest in those areas. Young adults who don't drive much grew by 50% between 1995 and 2009. That's either good news or bad news. Well, some of those are highly mobile multimodals making a lot of trips per day. That's good news. Many more of them were carless and mobility disadvantaged, and that was bad news. So what are some implications? First, it's probably premature to argue that driving among youth is passé. And in fact, we argued that as the economy recovered, we expected to see some increases in per capita driving, and it looks like we're seeing that. It's not at all clear that recent travel trends in millennial travel behavior persist. We didn't have time to go into it, but there's evidence that young adults are taking longer to transition to adulthood, and that when they do, the travel patterns may change as well. What are some of the policy implications? Well, I think an important one is that effectively managing travel behavior will continue to require sensible pricing and sensible travel choices. We cannot see any evidence in our work for some demographic deus ex machina that's going to come in and save the day. We don't need to worry about anything. Millennials have changed their travel behavior, and it's going to shift everything all by itself. Instead, what we see is understandable responses to trying economic conditions. And we're going to have to go back to many of the policy prescriptions we had in the past if we want to address problems that we see moving forward. We argue that given the sorts of things we've seen about the number of young adults who were left behind literally on their parents' couch without a job or a place to go or money to spend when they get there, that we should focus more on the needs of mobility disadvantage and those that are increasingly left behind, and particularly those living in outlying suburban and rural areas. In urban areas where people can take public transit or walk to destinations if they can't afford to make use of a car, there are ways around that. But for those in outlying suburban and rural areas, they can literally be left behind and left at home as a result. And finally, we should target transit investments to urban and especially old urban neighborhoods where they work best. Transit works incredibly well in those types of neighborhoods, And there's all sorts of reasons to expect that if transit service improves in those areas, so will ridership. So that, in a nutshell, is the two studies that we've done. We've given you a quick flyover and are happy to answer any questions. And we also want to thank our many collaborators on this. Two of them so far have moved into being professors at other universities, and three more, I think, at least are on the way. So it's been a great group, and we can't at all take credit for all that's gone on with this work. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Brian and Evie, and thank you very much for boiling down many years of work into a 20-minute presentation. We know that there's an awful lot that still goes into this. So we actually have a lot of questions, and so for folks on the phone, I'd encourage you to use the chat function on the website and keep the questions coming in. I'm going to go ahead and tick through a couple of these and see what I can bundle together. They seem to be in similar kind of categories. And let's start with one about data. This couple of questions trying to understand exactly where's the data coming from. Is this NHTS data? How old is it? And can you repeat what you said? You're expecting new data coming in sometime by the end of this year. Is that correct?
Yeah, this is from the well, I guess some of it, we had 1990, 1995, 2001, and 2009 NP and NHTS data. This was supplemented by U.S. Census data, and it was supplemented by data from the USD EPA's Smart Location Database. It also required us to do a lot of post-processing in terms of estimating transit supply and data from a variety of other sources. So it took us a while to put that together. And actually, in terms of the neighborhood data, the research center that I direct, it will make this data available to others who are interested in looking at it. Is there anything you want to add?
The only thing to add is that the National Travel Survey data has a confidential version that has a census tract identifier that allows us to link the characteristics of the neighborhood to the characteristics and the travel behavior of survey respondents.
So in 2009, we had 73,000 census tracts in the country. We had data from at least one household in 30,000 of those 73,000 census tracts.
And will you be able to look at it get changed then from one study to another with the new data?
Yeah, well, we're not following the same households through time, but we will see, we will be able to compare these cohorts. We didn't even talk about this. We did a cohort analysis where we compare similar people born in the 1960s, the 1950s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and compare them over the three survey periods so we could create an analysis that allowed us to see how cohorts of similar age people were changing over time. There just wasn't time to go through that analysis, but we've done that, and we could, we hope to replicate that for the next round of survey data.
There's an awful lot of questions about the carless cohort. Do we know more about those? Do we know where they're located, and do we know if they're carless by choice? Do you have any insight on
that? The carless, it's difficult. Let me see how to put this. What we can do is tell you about sort of the demographics of the people in the different categories. So again, these are all young adults. Let's compare the multimodals and the carless. The multimodals tend to have more education, tend to have higher income, tend to have a license even if they don't drive. Will report having a car available even if they don't drive. Are more likely to live in densely developed urban areas. So what you don't find are a lot of multimodals who are living in outlying suburbs or rural areas. We do see a lot of people we classify as carless in areas where almost everyone gets around in a car. Incomes tend to be much lower, unemployment much higher, part-time employment higher, lower levels of education, more likely to be people of color. So in general, we would say that the group is socially and economically far more disadvantaged than the multimodal group. And we also see more geographic dispersion of the carless, right? Because it's easy to be multimodal in a place like Central Washington or in Manhattan or in San Francisco or in Chicago. It's much harder to do that in other places. But we saw the carless sort of spread around the various areas. The carless people who were in old urban developments tended to travel more than in other places. But in general, they're people who are making very few trips, not getting out much at all. So 2 trips a day on average for the whole group, that's very low levels of travel. Just 1 trip to the 7-Eleven and back would be all the travel for a day. Anything you want to add?
So also, we have a couple of questions on the transit aspect to this. Do your findings support the concept of income-related transit subsidies? Is that correct? To give people mobility through public policies that are increasing subsidies for transit.
Do you want to say anything about the transit paper we did?
So the transit supply was built into how we developed our neighborhood typology. So that was one of the factors, was sort of how much transit. So similar to the distribution that Brian talked about, the transit supply, of course, is highest in old urban neighborhoods. In terms of specific transit subsidies, for the poorest of the poor, this doesn't actually come directly from our research, but for the poorest of the poor, having transit subsidies will help. Although we have to keep in mind that transit and transit fares are substantially sort of cheaper than the cost of purchasing and operating a vehicle, which can be very expensive.
So we know that transit use is declining today. In this year, we've seen it all across the country. Do your findings have any suggestion about why that might be? Is there any? We know that you didn't study this and doesn't go up this high, but is there any relationship you think between what's happening with transit use across the country now and what you've studied before?
You want to go? No. It so happens that we are currently conducting research on what is explaining the decline in transit use across the country. We're focusing on California and Southern California because for 2 reasons. One, Southern California is actually in the midst of the largest transit capital investment program in the country. And the second is that the ridership declines are among the most significant in the entire country. We are exploring a number of hypotheses right now, and again, this is not directly related to this research, looking at declining fuel prices, increasing employment, changes in rules in California that allow undocumented residents to get driver's licenses, and changes in immigration. So far, what we're seeing are some surprising results. In general, we've tended to see over time an increase in transit service supply in outlying areas where transit tends to perform the worst. And we could often argue that transit productivity is declining as a result that we're investing a lot of new transit supply in outlying areas where it's really tough to deliver a lot of high ridership service. We're actually seeing some of the largest declines in some of the highest ridership neighborhoods in California, where we've had relatively significant, densely developed low-income populations, lots of immigrants. There's evidence to suggest that despite what you may have heard in the news recently, immigration has actually been very low in Southern California after being extremely high in the 1980s and 90s. And Professor Blumenberg has done work that's shown that immigrants tend to assimilate to the travel patterns of native-born over time. And because so few new immigrants are coming into Southern California, and those immigrants in Southern California have been here for a while, we're seeing shifts toward more driving and less transit use, and that may be one of the factors that's behind it. I don't know if you want to add anything more on that.
Let me return to our work on millennials and sort of link what Brian has been saying more generally to the work on youth. So part of the second project that we did on sort of residential location and geography looks at changes in residential location among young adults. And while certainly there have been an increase in millennials in some old urban neighborhoods around the country, still the greatest increase is in the outer suburbs, in these new development areas, where there's less transit. There's less transit to take. So since we still have that sort of outward sort of push in metropolitan areas, including, I will add, among low-income households that are suburbanizing, there's less transit to take. and it could be one of the explanatory factors in terms of declining transit use.
The last group of questions I want to is there's a lot of questions around household types and formation. Let me just ask one here. Do you see that young people with children are much more likely to drive or move to the suburbs? Does your data and information show anything about that? What about the likelihood of youth becoming parents?
Do I say anything?
Yes. So the short answer is yes. So let's start with the families with kids. So part of what we did in a number of our statistical models is look and try to tease out what are cohort effects. So Brian talked about the cohorts, so thinking about these generational kinds of effects. There are life cycle effects that play a role, and there are period effects, like the recession, for example. And still, there are these life cycle effects. Now, we have argued, as have others, that some of those effects have been delayed. And so there's been a lot of work on the delay in marriage and the delay in having children. But our model suggests that once households, once individuals, youth get married, and once that they have kids, they're more likely to live in suburban areas, and they're more likely to get around using an automobile.
And one thing I would add is that this puzzling idea that there is evidence that youth or young adults prefer urban living, but getting into a housing market often may require, making that first step into the most outlying, lowest cost area. So there's, unrelated to our work, there's evidence to suggest that may explain a big movement to outlying areas, is trying to get a foot in the housing market in some of the more expensive cities.
It's clearly complex, it's clearly multifaceted, and we really appreciate you trying to boil this down to a very short presentation. For folks on the phone, both Brian and Evie were cautious about trying to collapse this work, because we know that it's very hard to get through all of the presentations and all of the questions. And thank you to folks on the phone. We've got tons and tons of questions. We didn't come close to getting to all of them. I'd encourage you to look at the reports that are up on our event's website. I think you can find the reports on Luskin's website as well. Again, there's lots more information that's out there. Again, I want to thank you both very much for being here and for sharing your great research and expertise with us. Thank you all on the phone for participating in the discussion and for your great questions. We're going to stay involved in this at the Eno Center. If you'd like more information about Eno, you can check out our website at www.enotrans.org. I also want to encourage you to subscribe to Eno Transportation Weekly. It's a really invaluable resource to all aspects of transportation policy and practice. Once again, my thanks for your participation. Thank you very much to the authors. Have a great afternoon, everybody.